I'd like to introduce the reading tonight. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, over 120,000 people of Japanese heritage who were living in the US, the majority of whom were American citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes on the West Coast. This is in contrast to the very small number of German Americans and Italian Americans who were interned primarily because they were non-citizens. Between 1942 and 1945, a total of 10 camps were opened in California, Arizona, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, and Arkansas. We are honored to present to you a reading of Never Again, the story of the incarceration as told by testimonies from camp survivors. These stories were taken from an organization called Densho, which is a nonprofit organization based in Seattle, whose mission is to document the oral histories of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. They offer irreplaceable firsthand accounts coupled with historical images to explore principles of democracy and promote equal justice for all. And so now, if you can all turn off your cameras and your microphones, I'd like to present to you Never Again, a first-person history of the Japanese-American incarceration.
Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, stunned the Japanese-American community as much as the rest of the country. Japanese Americans would again be shocked when immediately following the bombing, the FBI began going door to door making arrests. Any Japanese immigrant man who was at all prominent and considered a potential spy, including Japanese association officers, language school principals, and Buddhist priests. Without any meaningful due process, these men, mostly heads of families, were summarily separated from their wives and children and incarcerated in Missoula, Montana.
It was the first time I saw my mom cry. But apparently the FBI came very early in the morning and my mom went to answer the door and they kind of shoved her aside, not brutally, but shoved her aside. And then they kind of just stormed the house and shook my father, made him get up. When they started going upstairs, my mom shouted upstairs to my sisters who said, get dressed, get dressed. And apparently the men thought my mom was giving some kind of signal or something because apparently they drew out their guns and rushed upstairs. And then they barged in my sister's room and asked my sisters if they had ever seen anything like this and showed them their gun. Does your father have one like this? My other sister remembers the men putting their hands through their sugar bowls and through the rice bowls and apparently ransacked closets looking for things. My sister always says they took away with them 2 items. One was my father's bow. My father apparently was really good with a bow and arrow, and he loved to show off how good he was. The other was sort of a souvenir Japanese sword.
A Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether he's an American citizen or not. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, United States Army, Western Defense Command.
Why did the FBI come to see my father? He was recognized as one of the leaders of his Kenjin-kai, Kagoshima. They were all groups in the Japanese community, and he was a spokesman for that group. Well, all the different leaders of the community. They even took reverends. They took presidents of organizations. People who were designated as people that could lead the community one way or the other were visited. And many of them were just taken away. So there was this system of people calling each other and just warning them that they were on their way to your place. They knew that eventually, everyone kind of knew that eventually if they had someone, a father that seemed to have a role in the community, then that person would be visited too. So then when they finally came to our house, I remember being in the other room with my 2 brothers and my mother. And there were these 2 big guys that came and were talking to my dad about this. And then my mother told me, she whispered in my ear in Japanese, to run over there and grab hold of Papa and start crying. And then she told the other 2, my 2 brothers, to go there and just look very sad. So then we did as we were told. I didn't quite understand why we were doing this, but at that point, you do what your parents tell you to do, and especially what Mama said. So I ran over there and I grabbed a hold of his pant legs and I started crying and hollering. And then my brothers were there holding on to Papa. And my dad was startled. But then he saw the effect it had on the FBI agents. They kind of looked. They had all this bedlam and crying and everything going on. So finally they left. And then after, I was to learn that my mother had purposely planned this, that she would have us kids run over there and make such a scene that they would think twice about. Because actually, it was left up to each of the visitors to determine whether that person would be one to remove. And I guess at the beginning, when they started picking people up, they didn't know this. And later on, they began to see that these are human beings that are doing this. Even if they were told their orders are to go and grab a person, they couldn't help but be affected by a feeling. And my father didn't have to go. I think my mother, had some reserves in her that she never showed us until it really was necessary, like standing firm about not going back to Japan, and then at this point doing that. But she never really used that too often. I had always thought of her as very passive and submissive.
No citizen can hold a dual allegiance and be a loyal American. I mean, Japs and Japs only. For the Italians and Germans are few and far between who are not here in good faith, and the few exceptions can easily be brought to book. I personally know a Jap who was, to all indications, a big shot among his kind, who, when his son completed high school, they whisked him off to Japland to enter college. Anyone suggesting that Papa Jap is a trustworthy American resident and entitled to be free at large and conducting a business under the same protection as other people is just pulling up an argument that doesn't add up to me. Herd them up, ship them to labor camps, and when we finish slaughtering their progenitors in the other country, then herd them back again and send them all back. Letter to the editor, Seattle Post-Intelligencer, February 5th, 1942.
But when the evacuation orders came through, we just couldn't believe our ears. For days, we could hear commentators, especially from California, who began saying, "We're going to put those Japs in camp behind barbed wires." And Chick and I would say, "Oh, that means our parents because they're aliens." They couldn't become citizens. The law forbade them to become citizens. So we're just saying, we'll have to go visit them, not realizing that, my goodness, they meant us too.
On March 2nd, 1942, public proclamation number 1 began to appear on telephone poles and buildings. This was the first official notice Japanese Americans had of their immediate removal from the West Coast. The notices stated that they had 6 or 7 days to prepare and were to take only what they could carry. They were not told where they would be taken. People rushed to sell or store in 1 week property and belongings acquired over a lifetime. Some families tucked their valuables away in their attic or basement, hoping to return soon, but not knowing for sure how safe their possessions, or their homes for that matter, would be during their incarceration. On the appointed evacuation day, thousands of Japanese Americans gathered at designated locations with the numbered identification tags they'd been issued tied to their coats. Watched by curious onlookers, they were met by armed soldiers and transported in buses, private cars, and trains to 16 temporary assembly centers in California, Washington, Oregon, and Arizona.
And it all kind of happened very quickly. And so people started either selling their goods out of their homes or trying to think of places to put their belongings, because then it said that we would only be able to carry 1 suitcase.
Well, as far as the evacuation process was concerned, there was a large Japanese-American Baptist church on Terminal Island, California. With only 48-hour notice, they had to move out of there. So we who were other Japanese Baptists, and in this case in Los Angeles, our concern was to help them evacuate and get resettled in an area that wasn't restricted at the time. And our whole denomination, of course, was trying to help wherever they could because it was an emergency. The Los Angeles Baptist City Mission Society represented a denomination, and the head man of that was Dr. Ralph Mayberry. They called him a Jap lover, but he really went to bat for the Japanese Americans, not just the Baptists, but the Japanese community. And he went and wrestled with the FBI in trying to bring this all to a halt. When the time came, we were evacuated and placed in what they call relocation centers. The church came to the rescue by providing lunch and refreshments for us as we took the train. But the denomination helped us in every way they could. There were so many that are indebted to the denomination for scholarships to go to the university back east or Midwest. And that's where a lot of us got our start.
And this is what I put down in my diary for the first day. The last day in Tacoma, feeling kind of blue, but also looking forward to our trip. We bade farewell to all our friends, and that was hardest of all. Around 1 o'clock, went down to Chinese Garden, had our last meal in Tacoma. At 2:45, we locked our front door, looked around our garden, and with a sort of empty feeling, turned our back on our home of the last 10 years. The station was a hubbub of people all trying to look unconcerned and doing a pretty good job at that. I boarded the train, car E, seat 7. At 10 minutes to 6, we were on our way. We passed railroad yards, the lumber mills, around Point Defiance Park, Salmon Beach, 6th Avenue, under the still proud-looking Broken Narrows Bridge, then Stillicum Beach.
I know the Army trucks did come into Bainbridge Island and started rounding people up. And we're all on the ferry by about 11:20. And I know there's a photo of a family and their dog. Their dog wanted to go too, so we jumped into the truck. And I guess the soldiers, with some trepidation, tried to get him off, and finally the family helped get the dog off. Yeah, they had to leave the pet with a neighbor, and I guess the dog refused to eat and died within about a month.
And we walked down the hill. It's about 4 blocks or so, kind of a fairly steep hill, but we walked straight down and right into Tacoma's Union Station. Yes, one thing that I can remember well, I did take a look back once, about halfway down. I just took one final look. Nobody else did. And then my dad, I remember saying, you know, when I came from Japan, I only had 1 suitcase. He says, I have 2 now. And he wasn't worried about whatever else he couldn't take with him.
In spring 1942, the Wartime Civil Control Administration, the WCCA, hastily prepared temporary assembly centers to house the individuals of Japanese ancestry who were removed from their homes after the signing of Executive Order 9066. The centers were surrounded by barbed wire fences and patrolled by armed military police. After spending up to 6 months in the assembly centers, Japanese Americans were moved inland to permanent concentration camps. The assembly centers were hastily erected quarters located throughout the West Coast at fairgrounds, racetracks, and other similar facilities, including the Puyallup Fairgrounds. Conditions at these locations were appalling. People were housed in animal stalls and barracks with communal bathrooms and mess halls. Privacy was next to non-existent. Most families lived in a 20 by 20 foot room separated from the next apartment by wood partitions that did not reach the ceiling. Shortages of food and deplorable sanitation were common. Overcrowding, uncertainty, and stress created tension in the assembly centers, even as the demoralized camp inmates tried to improve living conditions.
Camp Harmony. That was a hell of a good name. I'd been to Puyallup a few times when it was the fairgrounds of Western Washington. Little did I know that I would replace the pigs and the cows and that type of stuff, because they restructured the fairgrounds and the parking lots into these temporary hovels. And they had a hell of a lot of nerve calling it Camp Harmony. But anyway, it was a real traumatic kind of living. You're in the former stalls where the pigs and the cows and everything else were. Temporary shacks. Just the walls were so many feet off the ground, and families of 6 and 7 were crowded into one little spot.
When I think of Puyallup, I think of only one thing, and that is that we lived under a grandstand. And when we signed up for our quarters, we ended up with 4 stalls. I mean, literally 4 stalls. We had one horse stall in which we had 4 camp cots and 1 naked bulb hanging from the ceiling. I was lying on my bunk and I was looking at the wall, and I was flicking away at the wall when I realized it was whitewashed, and underneath it was dung. I mean, horse dung. And I realized what I had scratched up was horse dung.
We had barbed wire fencing all around the fairgrounds. And there was a road that passed by close to the fairgrounds. And they would bring busloads of non-Japanese people. And they would actually let them off and let them look at us like we were, like we were caged animals. They actually came and looked at us while we were behind barbed wire fencing there. So we were some kind of attraction.
The War Relocation Authority, the WRA, oversaw construction of 10 concentration camps in sparsely populated and isolated areas. Between June and October 1942, Japanese Americans were transferred from the assembly centers to the larger camps, one of which was the Minidoka War Relocation Center near Hunt, Idaho. The residents of Minidoka worked hard to make life as normal for themselves as possible. The children were enrolled in schools and participated in Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. Church services were held, baseball games were played, and young women even competed in beauty pageants.
The move from Puyallup to Minidoka, that was in August of 1942. I think that's when we took our first train trip. Well, as I told you, our family never had a car. I had never been on a train. And the barracks were very dusty and unfurnished. And I think there were cots there, but we still had to get our mattresses and army blankets and all lined up, 7 beds all lined up, and a potbelly stove at one end. But somehow I give credit to the Issei's for not making a big fuss about how awful conditions were and just accepting what's there and making the best of it. That's all that I could remember. Because gradually somebody got a table or built a table, and we had tables and chairs, but until then, there wasn't any. And gradually people started to make a garden just outside their door porch and learning to use public facilities like showers and restrooms and laundry facilities. To have to share all that and learning to live together without fighting about it is quite an adjustment. Community living, sharing.
I didn't like what was going on in camp. Number one, below the barracks, it's wide open, and I want to close that. Use the local people to close that. Here we had all the plumbing sitting out in the desert. Why can't we put it in? And I, as a civil engineer, I know exactly what to do. And why can't we use people in the camp? And the camp will say, hey, we have contracts out with such and such and such and such. We can't do anything. And I'm cold. I'm not feeling good, and I have to go out to the John between the blocks, and here it is 20 below zero. Hey, let's get with it. And you know, all that is starting to come back, all the things that we could do, and we're the ones suffering.
Well, it was horrible. I mean, even as a child, I remember it was an experience to go to the bathroom or to go to the mess hall to eat, which was fun. But the weather, it was bad. You're always slopping in mud. I remember the older men, members of the community, they made wooden clogs, gaita. And yeah, as a matter of fact, I had a pair, but I didn't use them because you had to wear them with bare feet. In the winter, you couldn't use them. The winds were just horrible when we first went there. I remember even as a child, the barracks, as you might see in some pictures, were built above the ground. They were not on slabs of concrete above ground. And there was an opening of 2 feet, at least from the ground to the floor, the bottom part of the flooring. And that was just a constant wind tunnel, if you will. And then in the barrack itself, there was only one plank. In other words, one 1x6 that separated you from the ground. And there were cracks between them. And the winds, I mean, the deserts of southern Idaho and the winds during the spring, for instance, or even in the summer, when we first moved there, that dust would just come up and go and permeate everything within that room. We only had one room for the whole family. It was brutal. The dust was just brutal as the cold. And the cold was bad too. You either froze or you boiled to death.
And oh, it was so dusty. You just can't imagine. It was just such a desert place with sagebrush and tumbleweeds rolling all over.
After we got there on train, they had trucks that drove us to our campsite. And I recall it was so dusty that I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. The condition was severe, out in nowhere, desert country. Public facilities, it was nothing to speak of. They had outhouses. Later on, they put in running water, but it was just plain desert, southern central Idaho.
Well, I remember when we first got there, the only thing I could remember was the dust.
Well, it was very, very discouraging because I say the wind and the dust storm, and you must remember that the camp was still under construction. Therefore, all this dust was being created with the wind blowing it up. It was very, very dusty. The dust was powdery fine, and if I recall, it was about 3 or 4 inches deep. So you just, every time you take a step, you would just have to have a puff of smoke, of dust. And if you have even the slightest breeze, wow, you're in like a fog. And when you go to the mess hall to eat, of course, when you chew the food, you can feel the grit of the sand. That's amazing. Even that, you get used to it. I gradually got used to the mixture of sand and food. It was terrible.
But the people gathered tumbleweed and make a Christmas tree out of it and put the tumbleweed on one of the columns in the mess hall. And the camps, they used a lot of canned food, so the can tops were used to make ornaments. And then the people make chains out of red and green paper and had it on the Christmas tree. And then they had a Santa Claus. And the Presbyterian Church and the Friends, the Quakers, sent toys for the children, like crayons and coloring books. So we even had a nice Christmas.
I remember reading a letter from a little girl who had written to I think the minister of the church, saying, in our church from New Mexico, saying, we wanted to send something for the children in camp, but we don't have very much money. And the only thing I could think to do was have some chickens. And so her father had caught some chickens and sold them. And so she wanted to send something to the children. And those are the things of outpouring that came from all over. And here again, when he felt that nobody cared, the outpouring assured us that there was a lot of concern and caring through the nation. I think those are the little things that sustain you.
To help administer the military draft and work release program, the U.S. Army and the War Relocation Authority produced loyalty questionnaires for all Japanese Americans 17 years of age and older. The questionnaires contained 2 questions that caused confusion and controversy. Despite serious problems with the wording and meaning of the questions, government officials and others generally considered those who answered no to these 2 questions to be disloyal to the United States, and they were transferred to the Tule Lake concentration camp, which was designated a segregation camp. Yes answers to those questions made Japanese Americans eligible for service in the U.S. Army.
Question 27. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered?
Thinking it over, I thought to myself, it sounded like you're going to volunteer. Well, we've been pushed around quite a bit, and I didn't like it. And so I said, I don't want to be pushed around anymore, so I'm going to answer no. I'm not going to volunteer.
Question 28. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization?
I answered on 28. I said yes, because that was 3 questions all put into one. The first one, what was it?
Unqualified allegiance to the United States.
I said yes to that one.
And the second one was defend the U.S. from all attack by foreign.
Yes. I said yes to our 48 states. At the time, we only had 48 were attacked.
And then the third part was forswear any allegiance to the Japanese emperor.
I never swore any allegiance to Japan. I've always been an American and pledged allegiance to our flag all my life. Therefore, I said no there, because I never had allegiance to the emperor, so I couldn't forswear allegiance. I was too young to know what the heck I was saying. So anyways, I said no to that question. And 2 questions out of 3 was yes. Therefore, my last answer to the whole question was yes.
I had something I wanted to prove to the government, that they cannot do this. I did not want to just blindly follow whatever they tell us to prove our loyalty. What loyalty? I was loyal. Why should I prove? Like answering questions 27 and 28. Yeah, I said yes on 27. I said, sure, send me anywhere. Send me anywhere, I'll go. On 28, I said no. Number 1, because I did not pledge allegiance to any other country, flag, whatever. And in 1943, I'm saying, what for? Why should I now all of a sudden pledge allegiance while staying in a concentration camp? Well, I was convicted, and I was given 3 years, 10 months at McNeil Island.
I recall that when the questionnaire came out, there was a lot of confusion because we didn't know the purpose really behind it. Was it going to be used to segregate us? The effort to get this questionnaire was actually started in Washington, D.C. in order to determine how many men would be eligible to serve in the armed forces. There was an effort by the War Department to find out how many Nikkei men would be available to establish a combat team.
The story of the Japanese Americans in the military during World War II is complex and in many ways ironic. It's a story of mistrust by the very country for which these soldiers placed themselves in harm's way. Many were drafted directly out of the camps and fought for democracy abroad while their parents and families were incarcerated by their own government. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was initially formed in 1943 from Japanese-American volunteers from Hawaii and the mainland. Perhaps not surprisingly, only about 1,200 Japanese Americans volunteered from the camps. Another 1,500 were drafted directly from the internment camps. In 2 years, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Europe became the most decorated U.S. Army regiment of its size. In less than 10 months, It had earned 7 presidential unit citations and more than 9,000 Purple Hearts. Along with the Medal of Honor, there were 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 330 Silver Crosses, and more than 2,000 Bronze Stars. In the Pacific, 6,000 Japanese Americans trained as linguists and served as interpreters, interrogators, translators, and radio message interceptors in the Military Intelligence Service. General Douglas MacArthur considered them crucial in the war against Japan. Never has a commander gone into battle as did the Allied commander Southwest Pacific, knowing so much about the enemy.
Well, I wasn't drafted. In March, I volunteered for the Air Force, but then my draft card says 4-C, enemy alien. Enemy alien? What do you mean enemy alien? I'm an American. Your draft card says 4-C, enemy alien. We can't take you. So I wasn't able to. No, they wouldn't take me. So I went back home, waited around. Then I volunteered again. But I couldn't volunteer until Roosevelt signed the decree that we could join the Army. Roosevelt signed the decree. That's when they formed the 442nd. Then I volunteered.
When the camps closed, Japanese Americans were handed $25 and put on trains headed for the places they had been forcibly removed from nearly 4 years earlier. Harassment was common. Many returning Japanese Americans were greeted with signs reading "No Japs Allowed." Others discovered their property had been vandalized or stolen. Homes and businesses that had been boarded up or left in the care of others were abandoned and stripped of furnishings and goods. For the majority who did not have homes to return to, housing was the most serious problem. Housing discrimination was severe in many areas and persisted to varying degrees until the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. Former camp inmates with no other options moved into hostels and converted community institutions with conditions not much better than the camps they had just left. Although this period was stressful, it is remembered as a time when people came together to share what they had.
Having no resources, no property, nothing left over from before the war, and to drop us back into Seattle and say, now start over. I think my father was given only $14 at the time to leave camp. And so I remember boarding a bus and we got to this bus terminal. I think it was on 2nd Avenue somewhere. And so from there, my parents and I carried our suitcase and walked up Jackson Street to the Japanese language school. And we met the Kinoshita family for the very first time, but they were very, very gracious people and welcomed us. So we were sharing space again with another family again, just like in camp.
When we were given permission by the 3 governors that we could come back to the West Coast, they were all initially against our return. They asked us not to come back. I remember because my parents wouldn't go to another state. They waited and always hoped to return to Seattle. They wanted to go home, back to Seattle. Home was not Japan because of their children who were American. They paid a tremendous penalty. Their dreams were put down under racism and misunderstanding.
I know one of the families that came back couldn't get the family occupying their home off their land and struggled with that for a long time and finally ended up selling it to them because they couldn't get them to move. There was one family in Kingston who gave their Caucasian neighbors power of attorney on their property in case something happened, and they sold the land without their knowledge, didn't give them any of the money. I know Kay talks about her family coming back to their house and they couldn't get the Caucasian renter out of their house, and that every time she was supposed to pay the rent, she would write and tell them she had to repair this or repair that and would never pay her rent. So when they came back from the internment camp, she refused to leave. So the family finally moved into the basement. And this person refused to leave upstairs. And so one day she said, one day her father decided he was going to cook as many Japanese foods as he could that smelled awful. And he did that for a few days, and then she left. So there's always a way to do something, I guess. The Japanese way.
That was a huge problem of resettlement. That's where Father Dai's book is. I mean, he was appointed by the WRA to visit all the cities that he could and the camps that he could, and to try to make some arrangements to help with resettlement. He was appointed by the WRA and, of course, supported by the Episcopal Church. And then the other Protestant churches kicked in with the National Council of Churches. They kicked in with help financially. And Father Dai was very good at talking about that issue, that the people coming out of the camps are Americans, and they need not be picked on when they traveled. That was the program that Father Dai was working on. And the Quakers were chief in making sure that Dai didn't come around in vain. Now, the Quakers were very good at that, but the connectional churches, too, were very good at that.
In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed into law the Civil Liberties Act, which, among other things, mandated an official apology from the government and monetary payments to Japanese Americans incarcerated during World War II. On October 9th, 1990, more than 2 years after the passage of the bill, the first of the redress payments of $20,000 per person were made in a formal ceremony to elderly Issei survivors in Washington, D.C. Similar ceremonies were held in cities across the country. While few of those who were incarcerated feel that the government's apology erases what was done, many believe that a formal admission of wrongdoing helped resolve feelings of shame and corrected misperceptions held by the larger society.
Well, don't forget, as far as getting it and appreciating it. But like I think the 20,000, I don't think you could ever replace the freedom we lost. Like we said, I could tell my students that when I talk to them. You lose your rights, your constitutional rights, you don't realize it until you do, I said. You get stuck back there behind a fence like that, losing your own constitutional right and all that, because technically speaking, you're a person without a country.
A monetary sum and words alone cannot restore lost years or erase painful memories. Neither can they fully convey our nation's resolve to rectify injustice and to uphold the rights of individuals. We can never fully right the wrongs of the past, but we can take a clear stand for justice and recognize that serious injustices were done to Japanese Americans during World War II. In enacting a law calling for restitution and offering a sincere apology, your fellow Americans have, in a very real sense, renewed their traditional commitment to the ideals of freedom, equality, and justice. You and your family have our best wishes for the future. George H.W. Bush, President of the United States, October 1990.
The internment was a dark chapter in American history in which 120,000 people, including me and my family, lost our homes, our livelihoods, and our freedoms because we happened to look like the people who bombed Pearl Harbor. I was just a child of 5 when we were forced at gunpoint from our home and sent first to live in a horse stable at a local racetrack, a family of 5 crammed into a single smelly stall. It was a devastating blow to my parents, who worked so hard to buy a house and raise a family in Los Angeles. After several weeks, they sent us much farther away, 1,000 miles to the east by rail car. The blinds of our train cars pulled for our own protection, they said. We disembarked in the fetid swamps of Arkansas at the Rower Relocation Center. Really, it was a prison. Armed guards looked down upon us from sentry towers. Their guns pointed inward at us, searchlights lit pathways at night. We understood we were not to leave. We cannot permit this invidious thinking, discredited by history at the cost of so much misery and suffering by innocence, to take root once again in America, let alone in the White House. The stigmatization, separation, and labeling of our fellow human beings based on race or religion has never led to a more secure world, but it has too often led to one where the most vulnerable pay the highest price. The Constitution and the government exist in large measure to protect against the excesses of democracies. This is particularly salient when, in an atmosphere of fear and mistrust, one group is singled out and vilified, as Japanese Americans were during World War II and as Muslim Americans are today. How terrible it is to contemplate, once again, that the government itself might once more be the very instrument of terror and division. This cannot happen again. We cannot allow it. George Takei, editorial in the Washington Post, November 2016.
Oh, well, I want to thank all the actors who participated in this reading. They are Randy Clark, Joy Misako St. Germain, Susan Kayeka, Ko Hashiguchi, and Van Long Pham. Next month, on April 20th, we will present How We Got Here, the History of Institutional Racism in Tacoma. And we will watch a video history produced by the City of Tacoma's Office of Equity and Human Rights, and then participate in a facilitated discussion. And then in May, we will host stories from local congregations who are learning to address racial injustice. 2 different Tacoma faith communities will share stories of what actions they are taking to more deeply educate themselves on racial injustice, to organize themselves to confront it, and what motivates them. So if you registered for this workshop, you are automatically going to get the email for the following one, so you won't need to re-register. And we do encourage you to share these workshop opportunities with your friends and to invite them to join us for the next one. And so on behalf of Conversations Around Race and Associated Ministries, I thank you for joining us today. And now I would like, for anybody's interested, we are going to break up into small groups. You'll be invited into a breakout room. I will post in the chat, which I have just done, some questions that you might want to ask. One is, what thoughts, feelings, questions do you have about what you just heard? And the second question is, George Takei's statement at the end of this play mentions how we can't let the injustice of the incarceration happen again to another group of people. So how can we, people of faith or people of good conscience, how can we take action in today's society and be part of the solution? Because it may not be the Japanese Americans who are being incarcerated or marginalized, but there's always another group of people in our society. And so, Sandy, I think you're going to break us up into groups, and a few groups will have a facilitator. The rest of you, I'm hoping you can just lead yourself in a discussion.